Can economic degrowth help to save the planet and fulfill our needs? That's what we will be discovering today, and we invite you to be part of this conversation by sharing your thoughts on this and with questions to our panelists. Today, I'm here with Alex Baumann, Lisa Bird, and Noshin Akrami, who are experts in this area. My name is Francisco, and I will be moderating this live event. First, and now to jump right into it, I want to ask Noshin, why is it that degrowth is so important right now and what it implies? What is it that we are degrowing?
Wonderful. Thank you, Fran. First of all, I wanted to say I wouldn't consider myself an expert, but I am a degrowth advocate. Definitely, that's for sure. Why is it important? It is important because of the polycrisis that we are facing environmentally. So that's one of the key reasons. But it's not just that is important. We also facing a crisis at social levels as well. We are seeing extreme levels of inequality within our societies and between different poles of this planet in the global north and with the global south. So degrowth is not just an environmental project, it's also a social project. And that's why it is so well aligned, in my view, with eco-socialism. We need it because there is a massive conflict between what we have known as sustainability, which has been sustaining the economic growth within our societies, and everything else that stands for a healthy, thriving environment and healthy social dynamics. We are in really deep problem, they're having deep issues with all of these areas, and degrowth is important because of that. So we can kind of reattain what would have been a balanced kind of a balanced activity in social, in environmental preservation, and also economic activity. So it is important in that sense, definitely. It's practically, it is potentially, and in my view, is our only way forward if we want to kind of sustain human being. I mean, the other thing is you will hear a lot about we need to save the planet, but we are not saving the planet. Planet will survive. We won't.
It is allowed to keep the balance, to have a balance, and to address social, economically, and environmentally issues. I like that notion. And in that regard, and about the balance that the world needs to keep, I want to ask Lisa, our another speaker, how can we see degrowth in terms of inequality precisely? What are key differences to keep in mind when it comes to degrowth for developed countries and for developing countries, societies? Yeah.
Well, thank you for that very tough question there, Francisco. And good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, good evening. And like Noshin, I wouldn't say I'm an expert, but I would say that I'm working in issues in which degrowth, is, I think, situational and also in some ways critical for shifting our way of thinking about the economy and the environment. So on this particular topic and on inequality, I think there are a number of drivers for this. I think first it's important to understand that degrowth is also very economic in nature. It's about the economics of growth itself, and it's also about the economic structures of our economy and how they in themselves are, if you look back historically, even look at our labor markets, are also shaped by gender, they're shaped by race, and they're shaped by labor. And you look at our labor markets and the way that they're segregated. But critically, also, they're about how we use the natural environment and natural resources, and how we produce and we consume. I think not everyone will agree, but generally, the information that's out there, the science suggests that we are definitely overproducing and we have excessive consumption. And a lot of that is based on natural resources, and we're using more than we have, and we're exceeding the capacity of the planet to produce these, which is usually why you hear the word planetary boundaries. And so the inequalities then become about how these resources themselves are distributed, how much are used for production, how much are used for consumption, who produces and who consumes. And that is a fundamentally economic, but also politically economic issue. There's about the quality of the resources themselves as well, and therefore what can you do in terms of growth? So what is the quality of growth that you're actually able to engender based on this prevailing economic model? It's about the generation of income and how you can use that income. You find I am from the Caribbean, and a lot of the income for many small and developing states is used to clear and to pay off debt. And there's usually a much smaller amount that's actually left for the business of development, and also the business of planning for the long term. There's also the inequalities of the risk. So the models of growth that we have used persistently over time are definitely are not just consuming resources, but they're generating economic and social as well as environmental challenges, as Nosheen would have highlighted. Those environmental challenges, particularly if you think about land degradation, you think about um, soil loss, biodiversity loss, you think about climate variability and change, those are not equally distributed in terms of how they are impacting, who has the capacity to adapt and cope, the length of the impact of those effects. There are many levels of inequality. And so these are some of the issues that I think are very critical for understanding why there is and needs to be a conversation about degrowth, why there needs to be a conversation about how our economic models drive the use of resources, but also generate income and wealth, and also support social well-being. And how do they also contribute to ecological well-being, upon which this very growth is dependent. And so the dependencies is also a part of this inequality issue. Again, if I look at small and developing states or a lot of developing countries, a lot of their economic growth is very directly tied to the most primary and basic use of natural resources. And therefore, their ability to leave those resources to be able to regenerate is not there. The pressures are significant. And so the inequality of the ability to manage the risk inherent in the process, and the inequality in the process of managing this for the long term, shift your economy, is also very critical to this discussion. I'll just end off by saying that the inequalities happen at so many levels in this context. And for social inequality, we're also thinking about the fact that we, as a global entity, we generate trillions of dollars of income every year, but yet we're still having in 2024 discussions about childcare. We need everyone in the economy. We need maximum involvement in the labor market, and yet we have still not put in place issues about childcare, which allows both parents, but particularly women, because of some of the embedded realities and social cultural constructs that they're working in, to be able to fully contribute to the to productive activities, and also to continue to grow and to create different levels of quality of growth. And so the issue of childcare, I think, is also emblematic of some of the inequality issues embedded in the entire construct, and why we are having this conversation about degrowth. And I would say that given the political environment, degrowth is in some ways unfortunate, because it then leads itself to a lot of political contestations about the fact that it's anti-growth, while degrowth and anti-growth are not the same thing. What we're seeing, I believe, is that we need to change our economic model and structure. I always like to bring this back down to simple basics. Think of yourself, think of your household. If your household and your income was being driven by a certain way of doing things, and you kept finding that you were, bringing in income, but you're also spending more money to be able to cope with the cost of the income, you too would make a shift to be able to balance and make sure that you actually had money and savings in your account to be able to travel, to be able to invest, to be able to do long term. Similarly, at the global level, we're finding ourselves in very basic bread and butter issues, and the inequalities of the capacities to bear the risk, to cope with the risk, and to transition from the risk are pivotal to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And I'll take that multi-level or multi-dimensional inequalities that exist in societies when it comes especially to the use of natural resources for the economy in general and for our well-being as societies. Now I want to jump to Alex, and I want to ask you, does it mean now, based on what Lisa shared and a little bit about what Nosheen said, does it mean that we're going to have less resources? What does exactly degrowth means in general terms? What exactly will mean for societies of developed countries to follow the path of degrowth?
Thanks for the question, Fran, and thanks to the other speakers for setting such a wonderful context. For inequality, which is a theme that I think Lisa has mentioned very well, really comes to the fore here. I think Oxfam's more recent report on the Time to Care report gives us a really good indication of the degree of inequality. What it says is that around 10% of us in the rich world, about 800 million of us, are producing around 52% of global carbon. And that also has a sort of an equivalence in our material footprints of things like our soil use, land use, and water use, and so on. So the degree of inequality is fairly extreme here. So when it comes to degrowth, I think we're really looking at the way the rich world is functioning primarily, its use of resources. A recent the emissions gap report from the UN, which is a report really worth keeping an eye on, has told us that on average, these 800 million people in the rich world are producing about 20 tons of carbon per person. So that's people like you and I in very average people in the rich world. What they've told us is that we should be aiming by 2030 to contract that carbon emission and equivalent material footprint by factors of about 10 to 2.1 tons of carbon if we are to share global resources with what would be in excess of 8 billion people by 2030 and stay under 1.5 degree warming. So that's an enormous contraction and they go on to say in the emissions gap report that part of that contraction can relate to things like renewables, but a huge amount of it will have to actually come from a great change in the way we operate, particularly in the rich world. And that would seem like quite a daunting task for average developed world people to consider, that the contractions of up to 8 to 10 tons of carbon, 8 to 10 factors of our carbon footprint would need to be contracted. And that's the type of degrowth that would be required. Now, it really raises the question, how on earth would that occur? Dr. Trainer, I don't know if people have heard of Ted Trainer from the University of New South Wales. He's probably one of Australia's most preeminent sort of degrowth academics, has been writing and speaking in this area for 30, 40 years, tells us that these factors of contraction of 8 to 10 relate to our rich world economy as a whole. We would need economic contraction in the rich world by factors of 8 to 10. Now, how on earth do you do that when your average person is very, very reliant on economic growth to keep things like the roof over their head? We saw with COVID that just even the contraction we saw there in things like tourism, in hospitality, in retail, in various areas, put people at great risk, housing risk and wage risk. And governments spent incredible amounts of money to stave off what could have been a crisis for people's housing and so on. So this is why you'll see this image behind me here. I actually believe that until we can have options for survival that aren't so economically reliant on consumerism and growth, meaning things like tourism, which employs tens of thousands of people in the Australian context and globally, you know, a huge amount of people, which is probably one of the most carbon intensive industries and affluent industries we have in the world. People like Greta Thunberg and George Monbiot say it's one of the first things that would need to go in a degrowth society, tourist industries, because it's for me to travel to the Northern Hemisphere, I'd produce about 3.5 tons of carbon, which is 1.5 times my entire budget for carbon if the UN's 2.1 ton budget is to be believed. So tourism is real up there. But how then do you give people the livelihoods and the jobs to survive if these major industries that employ huge sections of our societies depend on them? So the reason we need these industries and goes back to the birth of our market system. The first privatization before we were talking about schools being privatized or hospitals, capitalism's initial privatization was land privatization, a phenomenon or a movement called the enclosure movement that enclosed and privatized land. From that time, people had to serve markets in order to survive for food and housing. This has reached, in late stage capitalism, this has reached an absolute crisis point where the cost of housing is driving the need for economic growth significantly. People's ability to survive is very much tied to that fundamental economic reality of housing and land commodification. So my particular focus and my area of expertise, which I have done a PhD in and I teach in post-growth thinking, it relates to what's called land commons, or the decommodifying of land, so that people can be free. Imagine if you were free from land debt and had housing and food production options. They could actually alleviate your reliance on economic growth incredibly. It could change your economic reality. And this is the sort of focus, I think, that is really required, not just preach to people about their need to contract their consumption, but to actually give them a path towards a very different way. And we have movements in countries around the world, like public housing movements, and increasingly we're really looking at those policy spaces to help us respond to the housing crisis. I think degrowth, actually, my position is that degrowth should really get behind this push for expanded public and social housing, as we see in places like Vienna, in where there's huge amounts of public housing, huge parts of the society living in public housing. And this could actually create a new basis for people being free from the need for economic growth and starting to localize a lot more of their production and bringing markets back into balance with local forms of productive economy, or pre-market economy, commons economy, which is our indigenous economies. It's indigenous to just about all cultures, pre-market cultures, mine being coming from Central Europe, that their pre-market cultures were on commons. It's the oldest and most widespread form of economic development, is pre-market commons development. I think we need to bring elements of that back in order to transcend the growth paradigm. That's my particular focus in my writing and my work.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for walking us through that. And now that we have a general or a global perspective on degrowth, I want to go a deep dive a little bit and talk about this idea or this topic, this model, in terms or in the sense that local communities can lead the way. So my question for the three of you is, how can local communities could lead the way in creating sustainable solutions that don't rely on this constant economic growth, but more specifically in a way that are indeed sustainable for the generations to come? Maybe we can start with Nosheen, then we'll jump to Lisa and Alex.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Brian. Can I just say thank you for both Lisa and Alex, because it was really, really good. I feel that I am in the perfect company listening to what they had to say. Absolutely. Alex, I remember when I was researching on degrowth, I started with reading about the tragedy of commons. I don't know if you've come across, I'm sure you have come across it, and it's one of those things to start to see where the kind of how they are taking control over the commons is a start with that. It's fascinating. I think one thing that triggered that, and I would have said that in fact right at the beginning, what triggered my interest and direction to get into research in degrowth was sitting in a classroom and my lecturer said, capitalism is good. How can we make it better? And I was thinking, should I have a rage now or have a tantrum right now, or should I wait to see if anybody else is doing anything? Nothing happened from anybody. But I didn't realize that most of the students who were sitting in that class were sponsored by an oil company. And hence, obviously, they were quite quiet when this sentence was said in the room. So in terms of what locally can be done, do you know what I think locally it can be done? First and foremost, locally, those who know about degrowth, those who actually can map these stuff have to spend a lot more time to inform people, because the minute you say the word degrowth, the reaction generally becomes like, we don't want to go back to caves, especially if you think about the kind of a contraction level that was required in what Alex mentioned before. You kind of think that, oh, am I going to give up this? Am I going to give up that and everything else? So we need to actually clarify this, why this is needed and how it would work. So educating locally is one of the biggest things for all of us who are informed about it, and to try and show how it can be applied, degrowth applied to different industries in different settings. Applying that is really important. We should make that our mission to do this. The other thing is campaigning. Once you have built a community of people who are actually informed and understand that this is not taking your dummy away from you, this is actually your map to survival, to start campaigning about it. So one thing that locally massively and extremely bothering me and many of the, say, for example, UK citizens is our water. So in the UK, we have a limited number of water companies. These water companies are privatized like many other things. And amazingly, like I don't need to do much to put money in multi-millionaire or multinational companies, investment organization money. I just need to turn the tap on, because my water company is owned by them. My water company is owned by BlackRock and Vanguard and alike. So they are there. So campaigning for nationalization of some of the serious services that we like necessary, like water, like so many other things that are necessary for us. That's one of the key things that citizens can do, aware citizens can do. And in terms of, in general, if I wanted to give a very broad and effective advice to individuals, it would be that degrowth is shifting our focus from consuming and using a lot to consuming a lot less at a better quality and consuming them well and taking care of them well. And that is what it is. So shift your focus from overconsumption to massively reducing the consumption of whatever that you are buying. Yes, it is about what you use, but it's a lot about how much you use. A lot more. It's a lot more about how much you use than what you use, but also about what you use. Then think about the environmental impact of the social impact of the kind of things that you use. I think one thing as well is quite easy to oversee is that when the impact is externalized, I think there is other aspect of degrowth for me is degrowth is an anti-colonial project. So you cannot or you must not actually shift the impact somewhere else and then say, I'm using something green. Oh, this is a green product, this is a sustainable product, without paying attention where the resource has been produced, extracted, etc. And who actually lives with the impact of what it is that you are consuming. So shifting from paying a lot more attention really to where the products are coming and ensuring that we are not colonizing in different way, green colonialism or whatever it is that we are doing that is out there. Because even though the name may have gone, the practice of colonialism hasn't. It still is there.
Nosheen, thank you so much for your thoughts on that. And before we jump to Lisa, that's something that I want to highlight: the how degrowth is not just not to get things or not to consume; it's to consume less and better quality to some extent. And that's something that I would like our audience to give attention to, because that's how we should be seeing this topic and this approach in a way that is more sustainable for our planet. So Lisa, over to you. How can communities lead the way and create more sustainable practices that are, again, sustainable for the generations to come, in your experience working with Caribbean communities and states?
Thank you so much, Francisco, and thanks so much, Nosheen, for getting it, starting us off on this and really kind of laying the foundation. I think this is it's a really interesting challenge. I think because local has so many different forms, and even the Caribbean, you have very many different environments and operating environments in which you are going to have to think about how you would do this transition. Building on what Nosheen said, I think a key part of this is it will be rethinking in some ways the social contract. How we all work and collaborate and live within a space together. How we share resources, how we manage those resources, how we make sure that resources are available not just for today, for tomorrow. And notice the kind of language I'm using, because I'm also always thinking about the fact that there is politics and eco-politics and social politics around these issues. I think, communities have in some ways been doing this for a long time. We talked about indigenous communities, which have always, which are known for seeking in some ways this balance. I think if you look at local communities where there's a lot of activism around taking care of their environment, whether it's beach cleanups, whether it is looking at mangroves and doing mangrove restoration, thinking in ways in which they can reduce their carbon footprint, they aren't thinking about this, but then the issue becomes one of scale, even, from that local to national and then that local to global. I think that there are a number of things that are happening where we're looking at whether it's sustainable tourism and thinking of reducing, of the carrying capacity. We're thinking about reducing the carbon footprint. We're thinking the water footprint. We're thinking of energy footprint, and we're thinking about how we can mainstream renewable energy into those systems and those structures and those sectors. But I think also at the local community level, I think the rubber hits the road in terms of finding ways of balancing the need for this balance between growth and the environment, but also brings in notions of environmental and social justice. And it goes back to the point that Alex raised about how do we do this while people still need to maintain livelihoods, while people still need to feed themselves and their children, while people still need to be able to earn money in order to do other things tomorrow. And so I don't think we have one easy answer to this, but I do think that there are important steps that are being taken at the local level and across the Caribbean. The steps being taken in the tourism sector to try to look at the ways of starting to rethink and to achieve this balance. What I will say quickly is that every change and every shift, particularly for the economic structure of the economy, requires transitions and a transition period. And I think often we have not always thought about transitions and adaptations as political, as social, as technical processes that need to be understood and need to be planned for. And they require, social inclusion, and they require an acknowledgement of power dynamics. I think that even within our societies and small developing states, those are able to make those transitions easier, quicker, and to be able to do without or to think about, sacrifice. There are inevitable issues about, wealth and your ability to make some of these sacrifices compared to somebody who doesn't have the same amount of choices now. And so you don't want to make it a poor versus wealthy person. But the issue there is not just the wealth. The issue is what the wealth gives you in terms of choices and the ability to be able to make some of these decisions and to be able to make some of the calculations that will benefit or be down to the environment. And so I think the broader conversations around that and lessons from COVID-19 are also critical here, as we were able to see in some ways a little bit of a forced regrowth because we literally were paralyzed from global travel, paralyzed from moving along. And so it's important to really just think through how, from a very social dynamic level. Also, if you're not hearing me, let me try to repeat that. And so to really think through how we would be able to think this through, to negotiate, I think is going to be really key here, to think and to anticipate the conflicts that will emerge about people's visions for themselves, their identities that are also wrapped around these of I think it's important not to forget that the way that society is structured, that we have in some ways sold a package that says that you need to have a car, you need to have a house, you need to have a certain amount of money in your bank account. Engagement around growth and degrowth. And I think those are parts of this that I think don't often get the attention. I think sometimes we've misunderstood or even under the gone into communities really being able to make some of these steps. But if you go back and you peel it back, there's been a lot of negotiation, engagement, and social recontracting that's allowed that to happen. So I'll respond to the question that way. Thing that I think the locally led is going to be really socially and culturally driven, going to be behavioral. I don't think we can get away from that. And it's about persons being able to say, okay, yes, I am willing and able to make this shift. I'm seeing benefits and not just losses.
I wanna also highlight that you mentioned there, Lisa, especially because we believe that locally led actions in regards of landscape restoration, in regards of wisdom and knowledge, are extremely valuable for initiatives and for the global goals as well, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, which will be another of my questions. But now I want to jump to you, Alex, and your reflection, a brief reflection on how could communities lead the way and teach us something as well, because I know that locally led actions growth, even though they don't have this theory or we don't dive that deep on these ideas, but they do. There are certain growth topics in communities as well.
Sorry, I may have missed a little bit of that, Fran, but in terms of locally led actions and degrowth, I actually believe there are some really powerful locally led actions that I would certainly advocate for. However, I also think we're still feeling our way in degrowth in this regard, because whilst there are things that people can do locally, what I'm very aware of in the research I do is that people are under more pressure than ever before, primarily because of the cost of housing, to commit themselves to whatever kind of job, ever kind of growth, whatever type of consumerism that they can find job opportunity in. This is just a fact of life for most of us. I mean, look at my reality. I'm a degrowth academic, and I rely on a job at a university which is funded by commodities, iron ore, gas, coal, this, and fly in international students with very huge carbon footprints pay my job. Why do I need that job? Well, I've got to keep a roof over myself and my two children's head, which is a very expensive thing to do in where I live. In fact, pretty much anywhere in Australia now. Um, so if my level of education around degrowth, which is 30 years of degrowth education, isn't enough to help me contract my footprint and makes me dependent on university commodity funding and international flying students, and if the world did what I did, and it wasn't just 800 million, we would have, um, a much quicker disaster. Then what hope has cultural or behavioral shift got for anyone? Um, this is why I go back to a structural question. If we have privatized the basis of our survival, land is in all economic philosophy at the very root of economics. Um, uh, you know, Proudhon, the anarchist philosopher, says that property is theft. Marx says all capitalism ideas can be summed up in one sentence: the privatization of land. Um, Even Adam Smith said that at the very foundation of capitalism is land enclosure, or this idea known as primitive accumulation. You privatize the means of production for profit, the means of production being primarily land. If we do not find a way in degrowth to give local communities another path, a path that doesn't that frees them from such intense reliance on markets, um, then we can educate them, I think, all we like. At the end of the day, they will be required to find market opportunity. That market opportunity will be growth reliant, and they can't be too fussy about it, just as I can't be too fussy about the type of market opportunity that I take. Because at the end of the day, keeping a roof over your family's head is far more personal and immediate than even an emerging climate or biodiversity collapse. You simply have to be able to pay that next rental or mortgage payment to survive. And if that means selling some ridiculous consumer item, then that's what you do. And that's what it does mean in our society. So to me, just very quickly getting to the community action, I believe that this does sound very big and structural, the decommodification of land, but there is a public housing movement that is actually reframing the idea of public housing globally because of the housing crisis. Here in Australia, there's been a big discussion now about the Vienna model and the Singapore model of public housing, which is re-establishing a policy space that frees land from markets, frees land from investment and banks and landlords and so on. If I had that opportunity, if I could, all of a sudden, I have agency around my involvement in markets. I could even turn a lot of my labor into local forms of production. I might reduce my involvement in markets substantially, in fact, to a couple of days, and supplement the things I'm not producing in my more regional areas locally, because I have liberated myself from the market system through a new type of land availability. It's important to remember that markets, when they first enclosed land in Europe in around the 16th century, that it began, that we started privatizing land. This was the first time that Indigenous people in Europe were kicked off commons and were forced into markets. This spread through globalization. Indigenous communities all through the world this was the birth of the market citizen. If we now want to challenge growth and we want to contract growth, we must reverse this enclosure of land and give people opportunities that aren't market or growth reliant. So this is the structural issue. And if we don't address that structural issue and simply talk about behavioral or cultural change, we will get the sort of ridicule that we are getting, which is, give me a break. How am I supposed to do without my car or consume less or give up my job in tourism or retail or commodities? I'm deeply reliant on this model, which, you know, as I just said, as a degrowth academic, I am deeply reliant on. So how could I ask anyone else to consider stepping outside that growth reliance? So in a nutshell, I would say, I'll wrap up here. I think the best thing local communities can do, which a lot of communities are already doing, is get behind the public housing movement, because that can create the structural shift that will actually give agency back to people to choose degrowth.
Valuable insight there, Alex. Thank you, especially because how degrowth is linked with inequalities and our current issues. And to that, I want to jump to you, Lisa, because, well, I know that at the beginning you said that you're not an expert, but I think you're just being humble. You've been working more than 25 years in international development, and more than 20 years in social and environmental management issues. And now with what Alex is saying and what Noshane also was sharing with us, I want to ask you, do you see degrowth being part of, or at least tackling some of the sustainable development goals that right now is kind of one of the things that at an international level and international climate policy, especially, we are constantly addressing because of how important it is to leave no one behind. So I want to ask you if you see degrowth being part of the sustainable development goals and sustainability agenda as well, and how do you see it happening as well?
Thanks for this question. And a great question. I think inevitably, whether, maybe not, let's fixate less on the name, but I think certainly there is definitely consensus building around resource intensity and decreasing that, whether it is about energy and certainly about natural resources. I think there's definitely a lot of discussion in multiple forms, again, using different words around notions and issues and mechanisms of degrowth. I think it's hard to think about dealing with the long term of sustainable development and some of the shifts and transitions that are needed without thinking about degrowth in that context. And when you think about that, then comes the inevitable questions as raised by Alex about the inequality of the risks that are imposed by the current model and the inequality of the ability to be able to respond and to make the shift in transition. And what you found is that sometimes there's been a conversation about degrowth more for the global north, while in the south is more about environmental and social justice, right? But the fact is those two things are interlinked. Even the discussions that we're now having a little bit more cogently and a little bit more readily around reparations, particularly for, and going back to the decolonizing and the colonial structures there, even that whole discussion about reparations is built into this. And the understanding that a lot of what drives, the issues and challenges we have and the overtippings that we have come back to fundamental structures of how labor is organized, come back to issues about gender, come back to issues about race and how people are allocated, where people are, how they're allocated, the kind of work, the kind of capacity. So even if you look at the issue of housing that Alex has raised, if you look through most countries, it's not only about gender and race, but gender and race are there, in that mix. And it's hard to think about why certain people have not been able to get past certain levels of that. And so I think it's important to the sustainable development issue and challenges. It's important to thinking about the goals that we're talking about. Now we're thinking about 2030. Now we have to start really thinking about 2030 and beyond. And I think it's going to be important for us to think about changing growth and changing how we look at growth, how we do growth, which will involve degrowth, and it will probably involve other things. But I just like to add that that degrowth has to be linked to, in a way, decolonization of certain aspects of the way we think. It has to be about a retaking and a re-ownership, taking up Alex's point of persons taking ownership of the transition, and how, and negotiating and doing the advocacy and doing the promotion, including with their politicians, about how this, will be funded, how it will be supported. I think it's also going to be about making sure that we tackle some of the fundamentals of inequality in that context, particularly that socio-environmental inequality that continues to persist and pervade, and leads a lot of people, some people, to be dealing more with the negative externalities of certain issues, while other people deal with the benefits and less of those. And I think it will require us to not just think of the global north and south, but it also will require us to really think about inequalities within our societies, even within communities and within households. If we really want, because I think this kind of issue is also the kind of issue that is going to require all 8 billion people, 9 billion people on the planet to put some time into it. And so it's not just going to be about those who can do it. It's going to be about everyone. It's going to require the capacity, the innovation, the mindset, the commitment of everyone. And so what I would say is that, yes, very relevant. Definitely, I think there's a lot of scope and opportunity for looking at how you apply it and how you apply it in which context, but then also doing this in a way that's going to really also address some of the fundamental justice questions, the distributional ones, the restorative ones in reparations, for example, the procedural issues, because you can't do this without taking certain steps, and that means policy and reform. And then I think even about knowledge, I learned a new phrase, epistemic justice. And I was just like, and this is about how you access and use knowledge. And I think that's another one. I think if you look back, we as Alex says, and she said, people are doing these things. They may not call it degrowth, but they're experimenting and they're doing and they're learning. How do we take that and scale it up? How do we mainstream it will also be an important part of this. So I think it's hard to separate the degrowth, in my mind, from the justice elements of this, and particularly when it comes to issues of climate.
Mm-hmm. Right. Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. This is very valuable again for the discussion, especially in terms of what are we gonna do next, right? Like there is the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 agenda, but what comes next? What are the next steps that we need to take? And in that regards, your insights are very valuable. The three of you, again, you mentioned at the beginning that you're not an expert, but I think our audience might be in disagreement with the three of you about that. I also wanted to ask, I want to jump again back to Alex, and I want to ask you specifically, because I can see here that you advocate, and you mentioned this already during our interview, that you advocate for revitalizing urban land commons for housing, food production, and other community-led initiatives. And we already discussed community-led initiatives, but I want to ask you if for specifically food production, which is something that here at the GLF we ask constantly and we address as well, food production and food consumption. What are your views on how we can maybe not transform, but how we can start walking towards more sustainable path of food production, food consumption? And let's try to answer it quickly because we need to be wrapping up soon. But I'm very interested in this question.
Give me an indication if I'm going too long. Localization of production is one of the transition factors from, relative to centralization of production. So things like food, but also things like housing and energy and so on. It's one of these kind of core degrowth principles, because if the rich world is going to contract by factors of around 10, if the UN emissions gap report is saying that's what would be required for 8 billion people to have a decent quality of life and keep the planet under 1.5 degree warming, then we will have to localize a lot of production. And But then the question becomes, how on earth do we do that when people's labour is so caught up in the marketplace? Where I live here in the Blue Mountains, west of Sydney, we had a community garden open. And a community garden is a wonderful idea in terms of local food production. It's a restoration of the commons, giving people back land access in order to produce food. Now, we had quite a few people attend that opening of that food garden. I think we had over 150 people attend. It's now got considerably less people involved. I think there's only a handful of people still involved in that project. The analysis I give to this is, again, that our lives are pulling us into centralized production. And this is primarily the case when you are forced to compete at ever higher levels for your access to housing. You are pulled into a sort of a vacuum of sorts of market engagement. And you're either studying for that market engagement or you're working in that market engagement. For the end of the day, you better earn some big bucks. That takes us out of that one of the transition points in degrowth is from centralized to local production, other ones from specialized skills to more broad-based skills, so we can be involved in things like local food production and housing. How do we move from specialized production when we have to specialize so much in order to survive generally and earn the kind of money we need? So we can start community gardens. We can talk about local food production in degrowth, but can people actually pursue this at the large enough scale that they would need to if we're not freeing them from markets? This is the key structural question I will always come back to. So when it comes to food production, I think the core thing is, again, we are seeing in public housing communities incredible programs. And I actually did a research project in a public housing community in Australia on community food gardens, which have a lot more success because people in public housing aren't caught up in specialization and centralization. Their labor is free. They have their labor back. Why? Because they have land security that's not tied to the market. So if really what we're talking about is giving commons citizenship back to market citizens, this is the key, in my mind, this is the key degrowth question. Can we give a form of commons? If really the transition is back to commons, because we're wanting to move from centralized production to localized production, we're wanting to move from specialization of labor to localization of labor, we're wanting to move from individualism to collectivism. These are all the degrowth tenets that would be required in order to lower our material footprint and our carbon footprint. If we're going to want to give those transitions and allow local food production, we need to free land from markets. Post-financialization of land and neoliberalism, we are so extremely financialized housing. You ask, I'm sure all of you could share stories of people you know and yourself where people are struggling, like this picture behind me, this man hanging off a bit of land to survive, to buy housing. And this you can tell people to grow their own food, but if they're that busy trying to survive, then they'll buy the cheapest thing they can buy from the cheapest supermarket, even if that food is from exploitation, from the land and exploitation of people. That's what they'll buy because their primary economic survival imperative is tied up in earning as much as they can and spending as little as they can, because that's the cost of survival in market economy. So I'm sorry to be a bit repetitive here, Francesca, but I would bring it back, the food production to the commons. I know people have attempted that with community gardens, but the problem with community gardens is it doesn't give people a housing option. If community gardens could also give people a housing option, boy, could those gardens flourish, because people's labor would be free from markets and they could be localizing their labor. So that's the answer I would provide. Sorry, Francesca, we can't hear you.
I can't hear you.
Sorry about that. More locally led initiatives, which is at the end of the day what we'll want. And I want to now jump to Noshane, and this is our last question. It'll be for the three of you, but I want to start with you, Noshane. This is so insightful and so valuable. Now we've been discussing at a global level what it means degrowth, at a local level, what communities could do, what specific initiatives they can take and steps they can take towards sustainability and degrowth. Now let's jump again to international and global topics. I want to ask to the three of you, how can international collaboration, how do you see international collaboration helping to creating solutions that are equitable and sustainable for all?
Should I answer?
Yes.
Yeah.
Go.
Okay. So I think thinking about what we need to do to solve the problems that have been highlighted by my peers here, Lisa and Alex, there's no silver bullet. There's no, I can't give you, here is a little bottle. I've made it. Go and take it. You'll be all right. That'll be done. This is your degrowth. It doesn't work like that. Listening to what Alex said, when we have to give the right to use land, and that's really, really important because land relates to our food, land relates to our commute, land relates to our water, land relates to our accommodation, land relates to what we produce, renewable energy. A lot, everything relies on land. So asking the owners of private owners of these lands now to give that back up. They're not going to wrap it in wrapping paper and hand it over, are they? So I have news for you. This is not going to be an easy journey. It's going to be very difficult, very difficult. I think the big part of this is about policy. And in the international arena, I mean, you will see there are a lot of degrowth advocates who are campaigning for abolishing debt. Like there are countries in the international arena, in the global south, that they are producing millions and billions of economic output, but they are still actually struggling at national level. You know, they borrow to pay debt. That's terrifying. They borrow to pay debt, and that's why the economic construct of capitalism has a serious problem, and we are tied up into it. And this, together with what I just said before about those who are holding control over these things are not going willingly to hand it over. Oh, I'm really sorry. Was that yours that I've picked up? Let's give it back to you. It's not going to be like that. It makes the journey ever more difficult. But will it ever happen? I think it will happen, because when the urgency for that is becoming to a point that, you know, Alex and I and most of us in degrowth, we have to live with this cognitive dissonance that we kind of feel something, but we are also enslaved by something else. At some point, that actually will explode. That actually will explode, and that at that point, enough will be enough, and we will have to change. So I can't do without saying this. At international level, at national level, wherever we are, there will be a revolution, and that revolution is going to lead to something different than needs to be. It has to be. It has to be, because the way that things are currently is going to kill us anyway. So we might as well die for something useful.
Thank you, Nosheen. Now I'll pass it over to Lisa. How can international collaboration help create solutions that are number one, equitable, and number two, sustainable for all of us?
Okay, great. Just want to check that you can hear me okay.
Yes.
Yes, good. So I think this is another great question, and I think there's some critical elements where the international becomes fundamental to this. I think because as I think all of us have said, the transition to Europe, as much as you want to see it driven locally, it cannot only happen locally. There's some fundamentals in the economics of the world, particularly when you look at issues of climate and how that will threaten and drive resource use that we need to tackle. I think the international collaboration will be important for the collective movement that's needed, and for getting this as part of collective agreement and policy. I think it's going to be important for risk pooling because there are going to be risks and effects of this transition, even though the long-term benefits will be positive. It's expected that in the transitions there will be wins and losses, and some of those losses may end up on some sides and not on others. And we want to make sure that we can also manage and insure against some of the risks that are happening. So I think risk pooling becomes a very important element. I think also international collaboration is important for the financing that's required to fund the transitions for smaller and developing states, for developing countries, for countries coming out of conflict, for example. They will need the financing to be able to put aside specific resources for this kind of transition, which may be aligned and integrated with decarbonization of some aspects of their economy, the shift to renewable energy like Barbados is doing. But the financing becomes key, and you can see it in Barbados' push under the Bridgetown Initiative for a rethinking of the global financial architecture and how that works, and how it will fund and support broader elements of growth. I think international cooperation is also important for those who can make an early start and invest and show the benefits that will help others who maybe don't have that momentum to be able to use that for the political and social negotiation that's necessary. I think it's going to be important for the research and for the documentation and knowledge management about what works and what doesn't work, to be able to save those kind of costs and also be able to help some countries to leapfrog into some of those transitions a little earlier. So I'll stop there and say that those are just a few elements where I see a need for that collaboration from the global to the local and local to global, and really when we talk about sustainable development for all, really having all hands on deck, whole of society, whole of planet approaches to really be able to take on the rather momentous task of making this shift in terms of our economic models and our economic structures.
Thank you, Lisa. Resource mobilization and also making sure that all voices and all hands are on deck, working towards a more sustainable and equitable future for all of us. Thank you. Alex, over to you with these closing remarks real quick.
Okay. There's an incredible growing pressure going on globally around both the housing crisis and the decolonization movement, both of which fundamentally relate to land privatization and post-neoliberalism, what's happened with the increasing financialization of land. I think movements like degrowth, movements like socialist sort of movements, there could be an incredible convergence of energy around the notion that really at the foundation of an economic system is its relationship to land. Capitalism's relationship to land is that it privatizes it, which then in turn privatizes our labor and forces us into economic growth. Indigenous communities have been telling us forever that you cannot privatize land. It's like air and water. It's something we all need for survival. It's not a product of the market, or it's not a product of the system. I think there's a real potential for international cooperation around this core foundational, land coming from the idea of foundation issue, that if we could bring that energy together around that core issue, we could have some significant shift, because government policy is already desperate for answers to housing crisis. Increasingly, models like Vienna's housing system and Singapore's housing system are being spoken about in very conservative policy circles. So actually, there is already a momentum in this direction. And if we could just consolidate the decolonization movements, the socialist movements, the degrowth movements, and the various other hugely energetic movements around this core foundational issue of land deprivatization, I think, to me, that would be a foundational shift that would allow and open up opportunities of degrowth. It would free people from markets. Degrowth is accused, and it's rightly accused of this, that it encourages contraction of economy. Contraction of economy, similar to recession, causes huge social disadvantage. It hurts real people. How do you change that? You free land from markets, give people alternative economic routes that don't rely on economic growth. That requires a freeing of land from market systems. So it's a foundational issue. To me, international cooperation could really happen. It already is happening in the decolonization movements and in the housing crisis movements. So if we could just consolidate this more, and degrowth could voice the environmental connection to this movement well, which it very well could, I think the international cooperation there would be heard in policy circles. So that's my feeling.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for to the three of you, Lisa, Shane, and Alex again, for this wonderful discussion. Especially now that we know that this is a concept that can be difficult to approach, to address, given the huge differences at a global scale that states, communities, societies have. But I think you brought us and you brought insightful discussion on this matter. That being said, thank you again to the three of you for joining us. Thank you for to our audience for joining us as well online. It will be also useful, I consider, this topic for our next discussion on climate and biodiversity policy around the world and on international conferences, in which these views can be explored and debated in a way that make us build a better future. And about conferences and places that we can discuss this, I want to invite you all, because next month on 25th of October, on the 7th GLF Investment Case Symposium, Rewarding Nature. This hybrid event will explore how we can channel sustainable finance to protect our world's biodiversity. You can join us in Cali, Colombia during COP16 or online as well. You can register on our website and find more information there. Once again, thank you all for joining us, and to our audience, have a great day, afternoon, or evening. Goodbye.
Imagine a world where every cent invested nurtures life on Earth and the well-being of all our communities. On the 25th of October, join us for the 7th GLF Investment Case Symposium in Cali, Colombia, or online from wherever you are in the world. Discover how we can mobilize critical investments to address the biodiversity crisis and support vital ecosystems. Connect with global leaders, innovators, and changemakers as we explore the future of sustainable finance. Be inspired by success stories and see how local actions can create global impact. Don't miss out on this chance to be part of the solution. Rewarding nature starts with a plan. Register now, and together, let's build a roadmap for financing biodiversity.